Hello, and welcome to this edition of the ILO's Future of Work podcast. I'm Isabel Piquer at the ILO in Geneva, and today we are going to talk about gender equality and inclusion, particularly now in these times of COVID. Our guest today is Chidi King, head of the Gender Equality, Diversity and Inclusion branch of the ILO. Hi, Chidi.
Hello.
We will organize the interview around three main topics. First, we will discuss the effects of the pandemic on the most vulnerable population. And then we'll look at what exactly the ILO is doing to promote equality and inclusion in the world of work. And then we will talk about the challenges that lie ahead in view of the profound changes that are already taking place in the world of work. So let's start with the pandemic. It seems that once again, vulnerable populations have paid the price of this crisis. This has been particularly true for women. Have we really taken a step back, as all the reports seem to indicate?
Unfortunately, I would have to say yes in response to that. All the data and indications that we have show that women have suffered disproportionately once again as a result of both the health and the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic. To give a concrete example, we know that 4.2% of women's employment was destroyed as a result of the pandemic. This compares with 3% of men's employment. And this is because of a combination of factors. One being that due to this persistent gender based occupational segregation that we have, women were overrepresented in some of the hardest hit sectors of the economy. So, for example, in hotel and tourism, in textile and garment, global supply chains, and other supply chains, which were very severely negatively impacted by the economic shutdown that came as a result of the lockdowns put in place to contain the virus. And of course, we've seen that women are not a homogeneous group. So women who were faring particularly poorly pre-pandemic, linked to discrimination on the grounds of factors such as race, ethnicity, disability, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and of course the socioeconomic status, have certainly seen their situation deteriorate further. All of this points to the really urgent need to tackle these structural barriers that have been in place for so long and that have, really hampered the goal of achieving gender equality and equity.
So it's not only women who have been deeply impacted by the pandemic, also migrant workers who represent 4.7% of the global labor pool, approximately 164 million workers.
They certainly have. And again, this is largely because of the structural factors that I was pointing to, including, discrimination in labor markets, including what we would refer to as decent work deficits. So not having adequate social protection, not having secure employment, not having a predictable income, not having access to things such as maternal protection and benefits.
Since most migrant workers are found in sectors of the economy with high levels of temporary, informal, and unprotected work, including in care work, in which many countries are primarily carried out by women, right?
And of course, migrant workers are very often in a precarious situation in relation to their status in a particular country. If, for example, your work permit is linked to a particular job, and that job disappeared during the pandemic, then you can see very easily how your situation becomes even more precarious, and how you may even become stranded because your situation in the country is no longer regular through nothing that you have done, but just as a consequence of an external factor such as the pandemic. And yet at the same time, we were seeing just how crucial migrant workers were to our economies, particularly in industrialized economies. We know and we saw during the pandemic that migrant workers are very often the backbone of these economies, working in sectors such as health and care, working as domestic workers, working as cleaners, working as sanitation, providing sanitation services. working in food and in food retail, all of those services which prove to be so essential, have proven to be so essential throughout this pandemic, see an overrepresentation of migrant workers, and yet they find themselves in some of the most vulnerable employment and work situations. So again, this gives an indication of the urgency to eradicate inequalities, particularly in our macroeconomic systems.
So the pandemic has really made things worse. So let's see now what can be done. What can we do?
So, Isabel, maybe I can start by explaining that the ILO is a UN agency. Of course, it is unique in the sense that it is the only tripartite UN agency bringing together governments, workers, employers' organizations, and workers' organizations. And these constituents of the ILO come together to both elaborate policy solutions to challenges that to be faced in the world of work, and also to put in place legal frameworks to guide our world of work.
The global community has pledged to leave no one behind when adopting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it all sounds very commendable, very well, but what is the ILO doing exactly to ensure that?
Just before the pandemic hit in 2019, the ILO was celebrating 100 years, of the International Labour Conference. And at that conference, there were two particular documents that the ILO constituents were working on. One was a centenary declaration, so a forward looking declaration. What was the future of our world of work going to look like? And of course, at the time, we weren't envisaging that just a year later, a global health pandemic with such significant socioeconomic fallouts was going to be upon us. So the constituents elaborated this centenary declaration, and part of that was calling for a transformative agenda for gender equality to accelerate, the results which have been insufficient to date in this area. And the second document or set of documents that were adopted, that were worked on, negotiated during this particular conference were legal instruments. So it was a legal framework to ensure that we can finally start to address and put an end to violence and harassment in the world of work. And of course, this has a particular gender dimension, which is reflected in the instruments. And the instruments also recognize that vulnerable populations, such as those that we've spoken of earlier, are particularly badly affected by violence and harassment in our world of work. Coming out of this centenary declaration, of course, a year later, we saw the pandemic. So earlier this year, the ILO's constituents, workers, employers, governments, again adopted a global call to action for human centered recovery to the pandemic. And this outlines a comprehensive agenda committing countries to ensuring that the economic and social recovery is fully inclusive, sustainable, and resilient, and that it does place gender equality at its heart.
So how can we translate these, goals of gender equality and promoting inclusive and sustainable growth in the day-to-day life, in the life of the businesses of workers? Give me some concrete examples.
So the convention that I just talked about is one very concrete example. Convention 190 and its accompanying recommendation. So that's how the ILO works in terms of setting law. It has the conventions are binding legal documents once they are adopted and ratified by countries, and recommendations give supplementary guidance on how the conventions should be implemented. And this is a quite an innovative convention, and it protects all workers irrespective of their contractual status. It also protects workers whether they're working in rural or urban areas, whether they are actually job seekers, so whether they're about to enter the workforce or haven't quite entered it yet, whether they retired from the workforce. So it's quite all encompassing, and it really looks at the world of work as being beyond just a physical building, for instance, such as an office or factory. It says that, well, recognizes that, public spaces can be places of work, particularly for workers in the informal economy. And again, for many women, we know that the informal economy is where they are to be found working. So the fact that this convention, recognizes the specificities of gender-based violence and harassment, and that particular measures need to be taken to address that, that it recognizes the fact that groups vulnerable to discrimination and inequality are likely to be more exposed to violence and harassment, and that places such as the home, so for instance where many are teleworking, or where many may be working as home-based workers, indeed in global supply chains, are also part of our world of work, and areas in which violence and harassment needs to be eradicated, a very concrete step towards advancing towards gender equality. Because whilst gender-based violence and harassment in particular continues to exist, we cannot achieve gender equality or indeed decent work for women.
Yes, and it seems that the future that awaits us, so that already here, it's not going to make things easier. It looks sometimes a little scary because COVID has brought up disrupted changes, but they're by no means the only one we're going to face in the future. We're talking about remote work or e-commerce or automation. I think they can bring a lot of good changes, but also a lot of challenges.
And let's not forget, of course, the looming climate emergency,
Absolutely.
whilst of course ensuring just transition for workers. And if we're not addressing the already existing inequalities that we all recognize, then these are only going to be further exacerbated by the rapid pace of change. This is part of what the ILO Centenary Declaration, and indeed the COVID 19 call to action are meant to address. If we're not confronting these challenges head on, if we're not putting in place the right frameworks, whether it's the legal frameworks, the policy interventions, including enabling women, whether it's through their employers' organizations or through their workers' organizations, to have a real voice in crafting the way our future world of work, which is now, it has to be said, the future is really.
We're already there.
Exactly, we're already there. If they're not having a real say in crafting this world of work, then these challenges certainly are only going to persist and get worse. And the world of work indeed will get worse for everybody, for employers and workers alike, because where discrimination is embedded, everyone ultimately suffers. There's a lot of talk, of course, about remote work. This can bring many benefits. It can also bring some risks that we need to be alert to. With women, very often we hear it said that oh, this provides a wonderful opportunity to balance your work and your family responsibilities, ignoring of course that actually those family responsibilities are also work, unpaid work granted, but also work. And the toll that this also takes when we don't build in to our policies, when we don't build into our workplace planning, and when we don't have a proper dialogue that ensures that issues are addressed correctly, that it brings with it all kinds of risks, including psychosocial risks, a higher burden of stress, a higher risk of mental illness and mental breakdowns, and so on. um, and let's not forget that for many, remote working, teleworking is really just not an option, because the kinds of jobs that workers are engaged in do not allow for remote work. Whether it's care workers who have been very much, in the vanguard of addressing the pandemic, whether it's our workers in the informal economy, whether it's our workers in the agricultural sector, who have made sure that we're all able to keep putting food on our table, remote work is just not an option. So ensuring decent work for these workers, ensuring that they have democracy in their places of work, ensuring that they have adequate social protection and labor protections, is absolutely key. That's something that doesn't change, regardless of the rapidly changing nature of our world of work.
Yeah, we've discovered that machines can discriminate as much or worse than people because sometimes algorithms, who can also discriminate against women or minorities in a more, in a way that people already did, but kind of more efficient, terrible.
Absolutely. And this is an area that the ILO is certainly turning its focus to. We've seen that the biases that already, exist in our world of work, those ingrained inequalities and, discriminatory factors that we've talked about already. Of course, when developing algorithms, they're quite often built into those algorithms, deepening, discrimination and inequalities. And we've seen this along the lines of race. In particular, we've seen it along the lines of gender as well. That very often when these codes are written, they're written with a particular person in mind, and that person very often tends to be a white middle class male person.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to talk about persons with disabilities. I think we don't talk enough about them generally. They're 15% of the world population. They've also been deeply impacted by the pandemic. They already face marginalization as well as limitation by public services to reach them. Do you think that the use of technology, particularly teleworking, can offer them new possibilities? Because I remember we published an article not so long ago about a person with disability, and he said that thanks to remote work, he had found new opportunities of working. Is this future of work going to be worse or better, or maybe we don't know yet?
Well, I think it's certainly, technology can be quite instrumental in improving, the lives and particularly the access to labor markets of persons with disabilities. Teleworking can be a good option for some persons with disabilities, but it's not a panacea, and it's certainly not the only solution. So those factors that I mentioned earlier, the relating to the decent work agenda, again, absolutely critical. And we need to be conscious of issues such as, the need to ensure, just as you would need to if the worker were in an office setting, for instance, or factory, again, you would need to ensure that reasonable accommodations or adaptations were in place. So you would need to ensure that a worker with a disability working from home, teleworking, has reasonable adaptations and accommodations in place to allow them to perform their work safely, securely, and productively. We need to be aware of some of the risks as well, risk factors that might come into play, such as isolation. This can already be aggravated for persons with certain types of disabilities. So again, if you're teleworking and not, having daily contact or in an environment with other people, the risks of isolation can worsen. Psychosocial risks, again, can be part of the fallout of that isolation. So we need to be alert and conscious and mitigate those risks, whilst all the while looking at how we can make telework a decent work option for persons with disabilities. And again, we need to remember that for many developing economies, where most most persons with disabilities are trying to eke a living in the informal economy, and telework is just not an option. So again, concerted efforts to ensure that persons with disabilities are actually part of the socioeconomic response and to the health response, indeed, of the pandemic, are absolutely crucial. And the ILO's call to action, I think, is again, geared towards ensuring this. But what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that in most of the data collection efforts that are being made to assess the impact of the pandemic, we're not seeing data being disaggregated by disability yet. So we really do need some further concerted efforts in this area, so that the right frameworks, the right policies, the right interventions, with the voice of workers with disabilities, are actually crafted and put in place.
So there's still a lot of work ahead of us. So, Chidi, thank you very much for your time. Our guest today was Chidi King, head of the Gender Equality, Diversity and Inclusion branch of the ILO. Please join us soon for another edition of the ILO Future of Work podcast. Goodbye.